To get people out of there.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last and best panel of the day, a day that has been really stimulating. Great conversation and questions. It's been a pleasure to be an attendee here, and I'm very grateful to the Wilson Center for hosting us, to INL and my hometown university, the University of South Carolina, for putting on this program through Just Track. I think it's extremely important, and the way in which we've addressed this issue, I think, has been quite unique based on some of the other conversations that I've been party to in the past. My name is John Simpkins. I will be moderating a discussion with Marissa Wesley, who's the CEO of Win-Win Strategies, Chris Jochnick, who's CEO and President of Landesa, and Amol Mehra, who is the Executive Director of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, also known as ICAR. Where I come from in South Carolina, ICAR is something totally different. But it's great to have you all here. I come to this panel as private enterprise as rule of law partners, and I come to this having recently served as the general counsel for the U.S. Agency for International Development, the world's largest bilateral donor, and in that politically appointed position, I had the great privilege of working across a number of different countries in attempting to not only provide legal counsel, but also bolster our democratic and governance function, a function which is severely handicapped right now because funding is flat and actually going down. So we have to be very creative in how we actually engage with our host countries on democracy and governance projects. We emphasize collaboration for impact. That may mean, certainly as a part of our basic business, working with private sector partners through grants and contracts. It also means engaging in transactional activity in ways that may not be familiar to you in USAID's general practice, that we have been engaged in some impact investments, and impact investments, particularly in the energy sector and clean energy. So the legal function there has been critical in engaging in some of those transactional activities. And then also creating markets or creating sectors of those markets, whether it's high quality coffee and chocolate, whether it's stimulating the production of mangoes in post-conflict areas, or bringing groups that had been in conflict together to produce things, such as an olive oil project that we have in the Middle East involving Palestinians and Israelis. All of those projects are very clearly geared towards promoting conflict resolution and conflict mitigation. They're aimed at building infrastructure to promote the rule of law, so that's pretty clear. In my position before that, in the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, as Deputy General Counsel, it might seem less obvious that we would be promoting institutions and infrastructure that would facilitate the rule of law. But even there, we hosted countries that were interested in improving their budget and management functions, both transparency in budgets and then managing against those budgets across their governments. We instituted, I think, a unique partnership at the time in bringing in private sector talent to work specifically on our IT function. So the U.S. Digital Service really is an early example of collaboration between the public sector and the private sector to solve very real problems and to have impact across government. We often don't spend a lot of time thinking about what lessons we can take from a domestic context and apply them in an international context, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to understand that there are opportunities that exist on both sides of that divide, whether we're talking about government in a domestic context or talking about government or governmental activity in an international context. And the conversations that we've had today remind me of a pretty pertinent example that I want to share with you before we hear from our panelists. And it's one that's rooted in the work that I've been doing really for almost 25 years now, beginning in 1993 in South Africa. If you were to visit South Africa in the late 80s and early 90s, you would be in a country where if you asked some of the corporations that were operating there, they would say, well, we live in a country of laws. Hendrik Verwoerd, who was the architect of apartheid in 1941, even described the system as the good neighbor policy. This was a framework of laws. It was a framework of rules. And yet, within that context, there are companies both within the country and outside the country that operated along a range of good, bad, and indifferent. And it was some of those companies who were uncomfortable enough with the system of racial segregation and separation that they ultimately said to the government, this is untenable. We can't do business here over the long term. So thinking whether it's long-term considerations or short-term considerations, in this context, there were companies within South Africa putting pressure on the government to change and to go to the negotiating table and work with the ANC. During that process of transition in which South Africa became a fully democratic society, again, you had companies that were good, bad, and indifferent, some of whom were at the forefront of anti-apartheid activities and equipping the new government to take on the challenges of operating under a new dispensation. Others that were just there to do business, and some that didn't want to have anything to do with it at all. Now, over 20 years later, what we see in what used to be known as the Rainbow Nation is a country in crisis. It's a country in crisis because, as we've had many conversations today about corruption, corruption is endemic in South Africa, and it stretches across sectors within the economy. It is deeply embedded within the government, and now the tripartite alliance between the South African Communist Party, the ANC, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions is beginning to fray, largely because the trade unions have been defanged, and labor has no real presence there anymore. In this current context, we again have companies that are good, bad, and indifferent. Some who say, we have to do business with whoever's in charge. And if these guys are going to be in charge, then we have to engage with them in some way that's going to allow us to pursue the activities that we engage in on behalf of our shareholders. There are others who say that this has to change because it is not indicative of an environment in which we want to operate, and there are others who don't want to have anything to do with it. So with that example, what I'd like to do is to hear from each of our panelists in the work that they do, addressing some of these questions about the activities of companies, good, bad, and indifferent, how their specific organizations are working in this area, and maybe what some of the big picture takeaways would be. So we'll start with you, Marissa.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks everybody for lasting to the last panel. I come to the topic of private enterprise and the rule of law, looking at promotion of women's rights and empowerment globally, and how private enterprise works with the rule of law in that context. My background is actually as a corporate lawyer. I was a corporate lawyer for many years. I've always had a deep interest in gender issues. My passions have been really around women's rights globally, and I, over time, became a sort of a bridge builder between people in the corporate sector who are working on issues, working on empowering women globally and trying to connect with groups on the ground. And that, over time, evolved into my current role, which is running a new nonprofit social enterprise, Win-Win Strategies, which seeks to connect the power of business with the deep assets of local women's organizations to empower women globally. So, what do companies see in this? The last panel sort of ended on a story of a lot of risk and not a lot of opportunity. I think that for many forward-thinking companies, there is a lot of opportunity seen, particularly consumer-facing companies. Women obviously constitute 50% of the population, often in the communities these companies operate, as their stakeholders in many ways, whether as producers, employees, customers, distributors. For some companies, this is particularly significant. We've heard a lot about the apparel industry, where women constitute 80 to 85% of the workers. Agricultural, women constitute 43% of the agricultural workers in the developing world on average, and up to closer to 50% in sub-Saharan Africa and East and Southeast Asia. And 60 to 80%, depending on who you're talking to, of the purchasing decisions are made by or influenced by women. So there are a lot of female voices in different places here. And of course, with the millennial population too, we're seeing more and more women graduating from schools and going into the workforce. So the employee population of many of these companies is increasingly women. So there are a lot of reasons why companies have been seeing reasons to really work to empower women from factory floor to boardroom or farm to boardroom. But one of the things we had been seeing was that the way this was happening was working on programs that were fairly narrowly framed as economic empowerment, doing the things that companies sort of think they do best, not surprisingly, providing skills, mentoring, perhaps some resources, but not really often being cognizant of the situations in often complex local contexts in these supply chains that might limit the ability of those skills and resources to translate into these women having actually control over those resources and power and agency to make decisions. Issues like violence at home or on the roads or in the workplace. Issues like lack of property rights or inheritance rights. Issues of lack of social protection programs that could not be accessed, child care or other types of benefits, and lack of access to reproductive and other health, for instance. And so what we have been doing is working on building a more holistic, rights-based approach to women's economic empowerment with companies and working to partner with local organizations who've been using this kind of approach for a while. But what we've seen is also increasingly more and more people are seeing in different sectors are sort of appreciating this kind of approach, and also the real sort of legal frame that often underlies a lot of the action that needs to be taken here. Most significantly, the World Bank produces the Women in Business and the Law report every couple of years. The last was in 2016. And it measures legal restrictions on women's employment and entrepreneurship. The most recent one looked at 26 laws that were gender different in 173 economies, and found that 155 of those had at least one law that treated women differently than men. These are laws like getting identity papers or passports, ability to travel, ability to open bank accounts, to access to open businesses, to enter into contracts, property rights, inheritance rights, laws on domestic violence, a whole range of things that will actually make a huge difference to whether women are going to be empowered. And what they found broadly was that lower legal gender equality associated with fewer girls attending schools compared to boys, fewer women working or running businesses, and a wider gender pay gap. So the whole legal framework for empowerment is part of a critical piece of the whole puzzle when companies are working on really, or anyone is working on really trying to work on these empowerment issues. The UN recently, with their high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, chaired by the president of Costa Rica and the CEO of IKEA, and comprised of 20 heads of governments and companies and NGOs, came up with 7 drivers of women's economic empowerment, one of which is ensuring legal protection and reforming discriminatory laws and regulations. And the list goes on. McKinsey's Global Institute has similar sort of frames of the legal framework being critical to the ecosystem of really empowering women. So what are companies doing? There are really sort of 3 issues here. One is actually having the laws in place. The other is actually knowing the laws and being able to know what your rights are. And the third is sort of issues around enforcement. And companies, I think, work in sort of have 3 ways in which they can work on women's empowerment and the legal issues interface in all of these. One of them is they can act directly when they control the issue within the company. So they can be active at having ways to enforce discriminatory action and harassment by building in mechanisms and enforcing rules very stringently. That's sort of the easy piece. Enabling is really the second piece, where you're seeing a lot of interesting stuff in supply chains where they can enable action by partnering with others, working with suppliers, working with factories they work with, working with NGOs, so that, for instance, GAP for many years has run something called PACE, Personal Advancement and Career Enhancement. It's a life skills program in factories and largely in South Asia. But it's a very broad-based program, started out really looking at building leadership skills and of women in the factories. Very sort of, it started out with the real core of that, but they realized that in addition to that and financial literacy, what they really needed was to provide legal literacy, teach about rights, teach about access to social protection, have lawyers providing all that information, the same way they would have health workers provide reproductive health rights, and have a broad talk about issues of violence and what the rights were, and had a much broader based frame. And that was delivered in partnership with the factories that they worked with, which they did not own, and with local NGOs. Coca-Cola, who we heard from earlier, actually, they have a program called Engine in Nigeria, which is a education and an economic empowerment program, education for girls, and providing routes into jobs either as a distributors for Coke or others. And they work with their local bottling company and with the INGO. But they also partner with the Nigerian government, because one of the keys of the programs is making sure every girl who goes to the program has an identity card, because without an identity card you can't access any governmental services and you can't access a bank account, and so a lot of what you're getting is sort of meaningless. But it's a way in which the legal framework becomes very important to some of these programs. The third way they act is really to influence and advocate, and we've talked a little bit about that in the last panel, because companies in many of these countries, big multinationals, but some large local companies too, have a lot of economic power in the country, and they do have the ability to sort of influence change, influence laws. They also have the ability, as we heard about in the talk about the Accord on Bangladesh, to sort of come together in a legal frame to be an influencer of safety laws and other laws that have a huge impact on women and girls and indeed all workers. Now that and quickly, but that was more of ultimately a risk reduction strategy, having started with opportunities, and I think that companies have for a longer period of time looked at dealing with most issues in this sort of ESG space, and certainly issues around empowering women in a sort of a risk reduction frame, which I think companies work with in a very non-competitive way. But I do think that increasingly, and one of the challenges is getting companies to increasingly see the power and the opportunity of doing this work as a long-term sustainability frame, the way progressive companies now think about environmental issues as strengthening supply chains, increasing productivity, increasing your access to talent, enhancing your brand. And hopefully in that framework, it's really more of a competitive advantage, and in ways in which hopefully companies will be able to see how accessing 50% of the population is something that will create a far more transformative world, both for women and for business.
Thank you. Chris?
Thanks. So when we talked about this panel, we thought we'd line it up as pro-friendly corporation, middling corporation, hostile to corporations. So, all right. And we won't follow that script exactly, but we also said let's just do a lot of discussion and abandon the opening statements, but it's so hard to do. And so I do have a couple of points on my opening statement. Hopefully I won't go too long. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity, and John for moderating. This is a great final panel. It's a shame people had to run off, but it's understandable. At least you guys stuck with it, which is great. Mm-hmm. It is challenging, though, if you've been here all day, to say something new, because a lot of the material has been covered. So hopefully maybe some of the stories or anecdotes will give a little more nuance, and that's what I was sort of thinking. My own background is I spent 10 years fighting oil companies in the Amazon. Then I switched hats and went to Wall Street as a corporate lawyer to see what's really going on inside these companies, and then I jumped back to Oxfam to help them start a private sector unit, and over the last 2 years, I've been running an organization called Landesa, which works on land rights. So I have a little bit of a varied experience. I think most of the work that I've done that's sort of relevant to this topic comes from my years with Oxfam, and so I'll talk mostly about that. And first, when I joined Oxfam, I think it's a signal, just one of many, of an organization, one of the largest development organizations, that until that point had been largely incoherent and reactionary to the private sector. And the effort to build out a private sector unit at Oxfam America reflected a broader, I would say, awakening in the development community that we've got to get our head around this whole issue of business. The development sector to date, to that point at least, and this was, let's say, early 2000s, had been either fighting very hard against companies because they're always the enemy, or taking their money, and they were just a cash cow. And so then the idea sort of cropped up, well, maybe there's more to this thing than just that. Maybe we could actually try to affect their business model, and that might take a little more sophistication. So a lot of organizations in the 2000s, I would say, on the development side, the human rights side, the environmental side, got savvy about the private sector and started thinking beyond CSR or philanthropy or just strict campaigning, although campaigning is very important, to thinking more about how do we engage in a slightly more nuanced fashion. And that's certainly where Oxfam came down, is the motto became no permanent friends or enemies. We saw companies as almost purely transactional. On one day they could be an enemy, on the same day they could be our friend. And we, as long as we're open about that with all sides, we could pull it off. And it's a tough line to run, but I think at the end of the day, more groups are moving into that space, which is to say that the Greenpeaces and the RANDs, even though they're viewed as more campaigny, will sometimes work with companies. And by the same token, I'd say some of the WWFs or EDFs maybe will be a little bit more aggressive at times. And so maybe that second part, not so much, but certainly the first part. The campaigners have come around to being more open to more of a collaborative approach. So the first thing I just wanted to underscore was that transition, or that I have seen over the last 15 years, that the development side, the NGO side, the civil society side has made a real investment in engaging with companies. And that has come from the idea that we need business. We need them sometimes as our allies, sometimes as our as supporters to what we're trying to do. We need them for systemic solutions. At the end of the day, every campaign has to end in a negotiation, so we need to be able to work with them. And that has been, I would say, for the most part, a successful or a helpful, a useful transition. Where that has been challenging, and here I'll give a quick example, has been in the cultural gaps between the NGO side, civil society side, and the corporate side. And never was this made clearer than the first campaign we did at Oxfam that I was a part of. Back in 2005, we decided to take on Starbucks, beautiful company. We had worked very nicely with them around fair trade coffee, but they weren't treating the Ethiopian farmers well, not giving them enough on the coffee prices. So we were pushing, come on, you step up here. You guys can give an extra 60 cents on the pound. That's what the government wanted. You're selling it for 24 bucks a pound. It's not going to hurt you. And Starbucks threw the lawyers at us, no, for about a year. And then finally we said, okay, we're going to step up the pressure now. And we went to the CEO, went to Howard Schultz, went to all their CSR folks, and we said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take out the ads. Back then it was New York Times. We didn't have Facebook or the rest of it, so we had to actually pay for the ads. But we're going to take out a New York Times ad. It's going to look like this. It's going to be damaging. Come on. Let's just do the right thing here. They wouldn't. Finally, we took out the ad. This was after literally a year of discussions. Took out the ad, campaigned, was a beautiful thing. Everyone picked it up. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. People love this story about here's Starbucks, the $4 latte that everyone loves to hate, versus the Ethiopia, which is associated probably unfairly, but with a lot of starvation and vulnerability. And so, perfect David and Goliath story. We finished the campaign. After 6 months, Starbucks came around, and then we decided, let's do a little learning exercise from this thing. Figure out what was going on inside these two institutions, Oxfam on the one hand and Starbucks on the other. And the thing that I took away from that, we sent a board member to Starbucks. They talked to them, and Starbucks did the same, talked to us. was they never heard us. They kept saying that they didn't believe us, that we were really going to do this. And maybe it was hubris, but it was also that there's just this gulf, and that there's just the two sides just don't understand each other. And we're getting better at that. The NGOs are hiring private sector folks, and the private sector folks love the NGOs. But still, corporate culture is very different than NGO culture, and that makes it really tough. And it makes it much easier just to stick to what we do best, throw stones on the one side, or just philanthropy on the other. But the engagement, the partnering is very tricky because of this culture gap. Second issue. We found that we could do both campaigning and engaging at the same time. And the story of Newmont Mining is a beautiful one, where we were at one time at Oxfam bringing up folks from Ghana and Peru to do shareholder activism and protesting in front of the headquarters. Very unpleasant for Newmont. Working with their board on a new set of guidelines for how they would engage with communities. Working with them in the voluntary principles on a new grievance mechanism where they were the one champion. And then once the grievance mechanism was implemented in the voluntary principles, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative, Oxfam brought the first case against Newmont. And so we were on all sides of Newmont, and we never lost that good vibe, good relationship with them, because we never were gratuitous about the way we attacked them. And attack is a strong word, but the way we ramped up the pressure. We did it in a very sort of calculated way. We talked to them. We were good-faithed about it. We let them know that protesters will be here on this day. We're going to take out these ads. It's going to get painful. We're all good. We kept talking. And that meant that when we needed them as allies, we could count on them still as allies, and they could count on us. They knew that they weren't going to get burned. But we didn't have to give up the stick. And I think it's really important that NGOs, at least some significant number of NGOs, as Arvind was saying, have the stick, because companies, unfortunately, often won't respond until they feel some real threat. And I don't think the consumers is the real threat. I think it's the reputation that really gets companies. And today with social media, reputation is a very easy target. Two more quick points. And I'm sorry about my opening statement here, Arvind. I mean, Amal. So corporations as champions. This whole question, and Amal raised it in the question last panel, and I think it's a really important one. Where we need companies now is what we used to say at Oxfam, to talk the walk. And that means if you're going to be a good CSR champion, CSR company, then get out there and start being a public advocate for these issues. It's not enough just to do it in your own in-house or in your supply chain. We need you on the front lines talking about these issues. And I will go back to Newmont again. Even in the midst of fighting them, when we were pushing for Dodd-Frank 1504, which we discussed a lot in the last panel, part of the Dodd-Frank regulatory system, and a really important piece, Newmont was the one company that was willing to go with us publicly and champion that, and that made all the difference. We think that opened up doors, that legitimized the NGO side. It was a real, and by we I mean the whole community of NGOs, but Newmont was the one company that was willing to sort of step out and be a public champion. It made a big difference. I don't think they ever suffered from it, and we need more companies like that. When we at Oxfam, one of the last campaigns I worked on was Behind the Brands. This was targeting the 10 largest food and beverage companies. And what we said to them is, we need three things from you. First, we need you to do your own internal studies and publicize them about the issue that we care about. We cared about 7 issues. So we want to see the studies about land conflicts and land grabs in your supply chain. We want to see the studies about women's discrimination, as you were saying, systemic discrimination in your supply chain. We want you to do the studies. Second was, put it into your codes with your suppliers. Like, drive it down the supply chain. But the third one was, be a public champion. And the companies were willing to do that. Coca-Cola went to the UN, and the FAO at least, and advocated for free prior informed consent, a big issue for land rights advocates. That is such untapped space, at least in the human rights and development space. The environmentalists have been very good about it. I think the women's rights advocates have been very good, well, somewhat good about it then.
Yeah.
You know better than anyone.
No, but I think we're behind the environmental movement.
But the environments have been really good about it, right?
Yeah.
And so getting them to step up. And then finally, I would just make the point about the importance of stakeholders. So I've worked in a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's always the NGOs and the governments and the companies. But what's often lacking are the people that are actually affected by this. And that means the workers and the communities. And that's important because a lot of the change that we want to see has to be driven by empowering those sectors. I mean, nothing really lasts if you don't have stronger workers and stronger communities. And often with our public-private partnerships or our collaborations, unfortunately, because it's so logistically difficult, right? It's so tough to get people coming up from the developing countries or wherever, or the workers. Sometimes the labor unions don't want to do this stuff. That's fine and all good. But it's just tough. Either politically it's tough or logistically it's tough. But what happens then is that top-down solutions tend to come out of those collaborations, and top-down solutions almost never work. And so I would just end my little speech here, my opening remarks, by saying, let's not forget that development, systemic change, transformation is all about shifting power. Mm-hmm. And shifting power means that the stakeholders in those countries, the people, the consumers, the communities, the workers, have to be empowered at the end of the day to hold their governments accountable, to hold their companies accountable, to be participants. That's like 101 for development, is people have to be protagonists. So, and in order to do that, these partnerships have to always be thinking about, are we leaving these communities and others stronger, or are we creating more distance and solutions that are marginalizing and disempowering?
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
I'm glad you didn't have anything
Sorry to go
say.
long.
I have 3 things I want to say.
No, that's
But
perfect. So
you should
I'm all-
go, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. I also have gone against my word and I want to share before we go into discussion, seeing so many familiar faces in the room who have such expertise. So let's kind of, I'm keen to also open this up. I think it's interesting. Let me also introduce myself. My name is Amol Mehra. I'm the executive director of ICAR. So as the continuum sort of shifts down towards the right, ordinarily I'd be on the extreme left. What we do at my organization is we question the role of business in society, and we look at how governments can lead better. What we look at is how governments can regulate or incentivize more responsible business conduct that delivers benefits not only to promote human rights, but to reduce inequality. So, when Chris was discussing some of the sort of cultural differences between NGOs and companies, I actually don't know if it's so much cultural within the organizations themselves as much as a fundamental question about the role of companies and business in our societies. I think this is particularly acute in today's discussion around the rule of law. I was listening to some of the previous panels, and even a concept like the rule of law seems to mean different things depending on where you sit, right? So I'm not saying we need to strive towards a common definition, but if you're a business and you think about rule of law, you think about ways that the rule of law can serve your business interests, right? The speed at which you can get licenses to operate, the pace at which judicial processes are undertaken, the level of security you have in a particular environment. If you're in the civil society space, you're looking at rule of law in a completely different way. Mm-hmm. So I think when we're having a question and discussion here about private enterprises as rule of law partners, we need to think about what we mean by the rule of law. For me, fundamentally, the rule of law is about 3 basics. It's about accountability of individuals and systems and institutions. It's about fairness in process, and it's about justice. So where there are sort of impacts or violations, there's a system that addresses those. And if we think about these as fundamentals, I really don't think that these are ideals that are just supported by society, but there's also tangible business benefits to strong rule of law environments. And I think we have to start looking at how businesses not only operate in jurisdictions, but they can also impact and shape the ways that those laws play out. So I guess my kind of framing for my quick kickoff contributions will be about the ways that business can successfully and contribute to rule of law gains, but then also the ways that they subvert it, intentionally or through passive, quiet means. Let me start with the positive, which is the contribution. I think that business increasingly is being called to play a role in advocating for stronger protections, particularly around the rule of law and around laws and regulations that promote fairness, accountability, and justice. You see this happening here with businesses being increasing targets by advocates around their stances with respect to regulations that may impact negatively civic space. But the U.S. is no exception. This has been employed in various parts around the world with civil society sort of leading the charge. You also see businesses advocating and defending the rule of law, standing up for prosecutions and judges and systems where there may be attacks against it, because they know that by preserving strong systems of justice, that there will be benefits for their own operations in a jurisdiction. I think you also see, very interestingly, businesses advocating for funding of rule of law initiatives. One of the most interesting and successful, hopefully, efforts underway right now against the Trump skinny budget, which would have defunded the International Labor Affairs Bureau's portfolio, which is, I think, I'm looking at colleagues here, I think 90 million annually that funds labor rights work abroad. You saw the Chamber, the Council of International Business, USCIB, signing a letter and engaging at the executive level with unions, with this group called the Friends of iLab, to say we're going to stand up for the funding that's used to promote labor rights abroad, because it creates environments where we can compete more fairly. So you see some really interesting innovations there, and I think those are just going to increase. The other way that businesses can contribute to strengthening the rule of law is through co-regulation. Government is afraid to regulate these days. I think, we've seen government step far back from using tools of regulation. So in that void, what can happen? And I think you're seeing some really interesting innovations around things like multi-stakeholder initiatives that Chris mentioned. I serve on the board of one in an area where government is not willing to regulate, which is around private security contractors. If we're talking about rule of law, individuals that are affected by private security contractors have absolutely no recourse in large parts of this world, including domestically. We have no protections for those who are affected by the activities of non-Department of Defense contractors through U.S. criminal law. So we created this multi-stakeholder initiative called the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers. It's funded by the Swiss government with involvement by the State Department, but primarily over 300 private security contractors and 15 civil society groups, where we sit together and we negotiate the terms of accountability for that sector, and then a mechanism of enforcing it, which includes monitoring of the activities of the private security contractors, as well as a grievance mechanism. So in a void of regulation where government is unwilling or unable, due to political capture, to regulate, civil society and business are building interesting partnerships. Finally, I'll mention tools and support where business can contribute. John, I think your example of the tech support and sort of sucking the brain power of Silicon Valley into the White House is a good example of that, but also a colleague from Microsoft, good example where there's some sort of tangible tools that business can contribute to things like the Office of the High Commissioner. Let me quickly end with my comments about subversion, because frankly, I think this is the more important thing, where the elephant in the room is. Business, as a rule of law partner, can only be credible if they step away from initiatives or activities that subvert that intention or that goal. So I never really understood why and how we can have a discussion, I still don't, how we can have a discussion today at lunch about, corruption and the FCPA being such an important tool, yet many of the businesses that participate here perhaps, or on these issues, are members of associations like the Chamber of Commerce that has been since 2000 whatever, including most acutely in 2014 with the release of a report and intense advocacy in Congress, been trying to subvert the FCPA. So you have active efforts to create loopholes, to carve out exceptions for things like the definition of a public employee. So you're trying to minimize protections that are built in law, but then we're talking about companies individually are talking about how great this tool is as a rule of law tool. It's like pick a lane. So I think for me, the lobbying thing is something that we need to discuss as a rule of law issue, and not just as about, companies can't, I think with good faith, say that they're participating and support human rights and the rule of law while participating in efforts like the Chamber's effort to gut the FCPA. So again, my final conclusion is this, that I think short-termism still prevails within corporate culture, and that the decisions being made by people in this room aren't necessarily the ones that are those that win the day within a corporate boardroom. So how do we shift short-term to long-term thinking? And for rule of law to be promoted, it's got to move beyond short-term gain, which is, again, sort of market-driven, to long-term business benefit. And I think that's how we're going to win the day.
Great. Thank you for that, Amal. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a moment. But I have a question that actually follows up on your very last point. It was as if you were anticipating this question. During this day, we've been talking about business, law, and policy. We spent a lot of time talking about business, law, and policy. We've talked around politics, but we haven't really settled on politics. And what you've just described as subversion is politics. And it is a company deciding that politically it's in their best interest to pursue those goals. Now, the great thing about being a moderator is that I don't have to be on any side. I get to take any position I want to. And so the position I'm going to take for the first question is, as a company, I've helped you already on the social front. Now, you can't come after me on a separate front about what I'm going to do about regulation. You don't get to decide every aspect of how I run my company. I've helped you in one way. Why shouldn't we expect a company to pursue goals that are in conflict? The no permanent friends approach from their side. So isn't that just a company looking after its own interests?
I'm happy to take a
Yeah,
crack at it.
yeah.
Yes, of course. Companies have every right to be terrible to women and good to indigenous peoples, or terrible to workers but good to their consumers, whatever it is, if they want to do that. And I trust, I just take that as, I don't put any stock in a company doing these things consistently or coherently or comprehensively. I think where what Amal is suggesting, and I take issue also, is where they take a position on a certain issue, like corruption.
Right.
And I hate to beat a dead horse, and it's getting deader, but that 1504 Dodd-Frank and Exxon will always stick in my craw, because the rank hypocrisy of a company saying that they are all for rule of law and anti-corruption, but undermining the fundamental pillars of it. That just doesn't, that is, the problem isn't that Exxon is good on women and malaria. That's great. We should all be very happy about that. But if we're going to talk in this event about corruption and rule of law, I think it's perfectly fair to say, hey, if you're going to talk rule of law and talk about the good things you're doing, you have to also justify in some way how you can be so aggressively undermining. So I think it's that hypocrisy that probably is the issue hypocrisy that Amal, that's not my position in the middle here, but that Amal is talking about.
But it's also the walk the talk thing, because you can't walk the talk if you're an Exxon and doing those things. You can't do that. So you need to get, we do need more companies who are legitimately walking the talk, but those people have to have consistency on the positions they're taking. And it's I agree. It's you can't you can't do that. None of us can do that. It's not, and you need transparency and transparency is really, I think, a critical piece of the puzzle here. And it's one reason why you, as Oxfam, can be so effective at doing this and be working on both sides. There are two things which I think are very important, because we're working with a lot of NGOs, locally based NGOs, to get local voices on the ground helping. But we're working with them to try to build directly relationships that transparent, mutually beneficial, equitable relationships that will ultimately allow them to be able to work in a way and communicate more effectively across sector, while also, maintaining the deep values they hold about the way they have to work. And that doesn't mean they have to agree on everything. And we'll always need the Greenpeaces we always need the people with the sticks, for sure, on the outside, but you need an insider strategy that is based on trust and transparency, so it allows you to actually send board members back and forth and actually have that conversation.
Right. The other thing too, I think your question is a fair one, and I'm not Pollyanna about the way that companies make their decisions. I just think that it's about accountability over the decisions that are made, and and I think you will see only an increase in companies being called out for for their public positions that they take as an individual and the ones that they hide behind as an association. And to me, when I see something like the Chamber of Commerce actively lobbying on the 1504, or the American Petroleum Institute actively lobbying, you know, I see such a stark inconsistency that the excuse of companies of saying we support them for other reasons. We can't determine their own policy positions is sort of like, again, pick a lane, because stakeholders are aware now more than ever of what's going on. So I think you'll only see increased attention at that connective part.
John, can I, one small little
Yes.
coda to this thing? I also think this is where companies are particularly vulnerable, because consumers don't pay a lot of attention about things, but it's pretty easy for an NGO to get traction on something that is obviously hypocritical. And so I do think there's a danger of not being willing to walk the talk. But I want to say where NGOs have found this tough, and I'm no longer with Oxfam, but where we found this tough is something Andrew raised, that Walmart with Love Diamonds or Love Jewelry, I can't remember what it was, but we had a campaign going called No Dirty Gold. And we kept pushing the retailers to only buy gold following certain conditions. And Walmart wouldn't talk to us. And so we published in the New York Times a list of leaders and laggards, and Walmart was on the laggards. And the next day they called us and they said, we'll do anything. You tell us, we'll buy the mine, and we will ensure that it's good. We want to be on the leader side. And we said, all right, that's great. But then we had a problem, because then it came time to actually announce, hey, who's really stepping up? And Walmart was stepping up. And it gets very tough for an NGO to take its and this is a tiny segment of Walmart's overall footprint, let's say.
Right.
I mean, the worker issues were huge at that
Huge.
time, and they still are. The healthcare issues were huge, what was going on. So if Oxfam is going to say something to the media about, Walmart is good on Love Diamonds, it would get the danger of that being tagged as, Oxfam now believes
Like some
Walmart
Walmart.
is a good company. So that gets really tricky for NGOs that are trying to work with companies on one issue if they're not mindful of all the others. And we had nightmare communication scenarios where we had to make sure that every sentence always, if it had a good part, it always had a condition. They're good on this issue, but don't forget the labor stuff. And that's where it got sort of tricky dealing with companies that are good on one but not so good on the other.
So one more question before we open this up, because this has occurred to me during this part of our conversation. Really, at the core, what we've been talking about today is promoting equity, inclusion in societies, diversity. So that whole concept of diversity, equity, inclusion is really at the heart of the work that a lot of organizations are pursuing and are hoping to have corporate partners join them in that effort. It strikes me as a question that has to be asked, which is, if you're pursuing these goals, which are ultimately diversity, equity, and inclusion, is it possible to achieve those goals when, A, the corporate partners may themselves not reflect that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and B, the NGO partners also may suffer from a lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
My office certainly does not. No, I mean, I think it's a fair point, right? So, like, the question, it's like, how deep does the talk, how much is there a walk the talk and talk the walk
Yeah.
component here?
And how much you're going to accomplish
Yeah.
if the people who are seeking these
Yeah.
ends don't reflect the communities in which they
I mean,
work.
yeah, so, okay, look, I don't know if I would necessarily agree with the diversity, equity, inclusion framing. I think for us, at least, our angle here is a company engaging in ways that respect and promote, or respect at a minimum, human rights and labor rights in their supply chain and their operations? And can they engage in a productive way to increase rights respect in their societies? So for me, the first question is, are they doing it themselves? And if they are not, I don't think it's appropriate for civil society to expect them to stand up for it. There's a lack of credibility there. I don't know if that answers but
Well, I mean, diversity, equity, inclusion are a frame, obviously, that my work has more connection to, although it is a bit of a broader sort of rights-based frame. And I do deeply believe that the companies that one has the most, that will have the most transformative impact, and that one has the most likelihood of success partnering with and getting to partner on these, and look in frames that are more rights-based and more looking at these broader issues, are the companies that are actually really thinking about women's empowerment, gender equality, as an issue across the organization. It is much easier to get companies to go to the next level if they have 40% women on their board and 70% women in senior management and 80% of their employees are women. I mean, there may be other reasons for that, and 80% of their customers are women. But if you see them and they're actually working in their supply chain, if you're working with a company like that, you're starting in a different place. But it's a parallel path, and people are moving at different levels and at different speeds, and corporations are also highly siloed. And so the CSR team is different than the diversity and inclusion team is different than the supply chain team. And unless you're in the rare company where people are connected, that's often not the case. And it's often true, as we've heard in the Rana Plaza case and many other cases, that sometimes the worst, Nike with child labor in the past, it's the worst situations that sometimes actually create the biggest reaction and the biggest sort of light bulb going off moment and ultimately greater change. So I don't know, it's easier to engage with the companies who have the broader view across the company, but it's not the only way.
Yeah, just a quick word on this, because this was always a challenge. And again, I guess I'll speak to when I used to work at Oxfam. There, it was tricky. You know, there were people at Oxfam that would basically say, these companies are so bad, we shouldn't even be talking to them. And the position that I pushed, and I think ultimately won the day there, was that even the worst companies, our goal is to help people that are living in poverty. And if we can have a discussion with companies that are some of the worst and move the dial on them, it's worth doing. Except if by working with them, we are legitimizing them or facilitating the bad stuff that they're doing. So we would put strict conditions on any kind of conversations, and we would think long and hard about any kind of public collaboration with companies, and it would always go through that filter. Are we ultimately doing more good or bad? And the bad side was, are we greenwashing a bad company? Are we making life easier for them
Or
to do
pinkwashing.
or pinkwashing, or blue washing,
Blue washing.
whitewashing? Are we doing something to help them do whatever they're doing? So are we normalizing or legitimizing bad practices, or are we hurting ourselves, our own reputation, which would be thrown into the mix? And those, but usually that would certainly not preclude any kind of a dialogue, no matter how bad the company was, as long as the company couldn't turn around and start trumpeting that dialogue.
All right, enough of this jibber jabber. Got questions from the audience? And please introduce yourself before you speak.
Sure. Bama Athreya, USAID, and had to work to think of a question that was worthy of our panelists here. And so I want to pick up on something, you know, Chris, that you've kind of raised in a couple of your comments about the nature of collaboration. So I work for USAID. USAID does a lot of public-private partnerships, and so this is a very live question. If we are going to put our brand forward in a collaboration with a corporation, what are, you can't, as you've just put it, you can't ask for everything, because the nature of the project we may be doing with them may be limited to a particular issue. But on the other hand, there's reputational risk for us as well. So what are the right steps and types of due diligence that, you know, a government entity should take? And, you know, as Amal knows, I mean, I've worked a whole lot on what are the right sorts of parameters for public procurement, ethical procurement for the government, you know, over some time now. And so this is a question that we still don't have a really definitive answer to. What are the right parameters? Not even in the case of our awarding, you know, a contract, but just in the case of doing a collaboration to co-fund something, what would be the right sorts of parameters to put in place? I'm going to just note something for the audience, if you don't know, that I think makes it more challenging. You know, speaking of rules and rollback of rules, the sort of thing that makes this a challenging question is when you have a rule in place, such as the one that the Department of Labor had put forward just under the end of the last administration, that requires, for instance, contractors to disclose if they have labor law violations, then at least you can know. But that rule was revoked, so if you can't even ask the company to disclose its past legal violations, you know, that puts us in a tricky situation. So I'm going to put that out there too, because think about my question in the context of a time when we may not be able even to ask the company to give us its record, particularly with respect to legal violations in the countries where we work.
Oh,
No,
well,
it was,
I'm happy to take
yeah,
it.
I'm happy to say something too, but it's directed.
Thanks, Bama. Yes, certainly a worthy question. So at Landesa, where I am currently working, we work with some of the USAID collaborations, the public-private partnerships, and I'm a big believer in those if they meet certain criteria, and I think your question goes to that. One of them ought to be, is there a real meaningful way for stakeholders to participate in the design of the public-private partnership? So is there does civil society have a voice in some fashion? And does the overall collaboration promote more rule of law or more transparency? And your point on labor rules is well taken. Does it ultimately empower the people that you are trying to get to? So is this public-private partnership good for the farmers that you're that you're trying to support, the smallholder farmers, for the women, for the workers? And those would be the sort of questions, in addition to just bringing the investment to those countries, which is usually what the first criteria. I would want to make sure, if I were USAID and I was involved in this, that I know that, yes, this is going to bring more investment dollars, but it is also going to contribute some significant way towards greater accountability, greater transparency, greater participation, or some one of those at least, so that it would balance off whatever problematic side you might be encouraging. And so, for example, if the collaboration was going to promote more large-scale investment, you'd want to certainly be mindful, and I know USAID is, about all the different issues that can arise with that, and then think of what would be enough countervailing good to, I guess, offset what could be the negatives, people being displaced, or concentration of power, or political capture, and think about, have an open discussion about that. And I think in order to have that kind of open discussion, you have to have stakeholders at the table to be part of that, so the process then becomes important from the first day. But be interesting to hear what others think about those things.
No, great answer. I agree with the stakeholder involvement. I think it's very, and other people have made the point about, I think you made it earlier, about top-down versus bottom-up. If you're not really involving people who are going to be affected very locally, and getting that voice in the conversation at the design stage as opposed to the, later down the road, and build those relationships in a meaningful three-way way, I think you get a lot of information there that you just can't get in any other way, too. But it's hard. It's hard when you work at the scale of USAID, because it's a lot of, and partnerships are always hard. So I don't have any great answers beyond your view.
I mean, maybe mine is more philosophical, and this is perhaps where I am a little Pollyanna about things, and I'd be curious to hear reflections in the room. I mean, a lot of this discussion is premised on the assumption that it is good that the private sector helps development aims, right? The whole Sustainable Development Goals and the Financing for Development agenda is sort of like unleashing these epic sort of grandiose words about what private sector money could do to shift the development paradigm. I don't know. I wonder if that's really something that we should look at with the current model of deregulation and anti-regulation sentiment that exists across at least this country. So, I could see an argument for having some sort of like assistance from the private sector, but if that's also coupled with like a deregulatory agenda, then it's sort of like completing the capture of this entire political process. Super philosophical, perhaps, but I mean, think about it, right? So now we're saying that the private sector can do everything that governments should have been able to do, which is build rule of law, strengthen the rights protections, et cetera. I fundamentally question whether this is going to lead us to the desired end state. And I know that's not related to your question, Bama. It's bigger.
It is bigger, and I mean, I don't disagree with you, though I don't disagree with you that there is a very anti-democratic aspect to having corporate involvement in much of this, and this has come out in other panels. On the other hand, I am fundamentally a pragmatist, and I see a lot of companies with a lot of resources and a lot of access and a lot of networks and a lot of ability to do good if motivated in the right way. Now, how you get the mix of government motivation and in a deregulatory environment to sort of drive that and a return to a vision of capitalism that was easy in a old-time community setting where you had your employees and your customers and, you know, everyone was sort of in the same place, you know, and so you did have a sense that you were working for a group in a global, how you convert that into a globalized world of multiple stakeholder responsibility and long-termism is a challenge. But I think to ignore the reality of the power of corporations and the lack of power of many governments, particularly with all the corruption, is a missed opportunity.
Other questions?
I had a question which goes to, well, you raised an interesting point, which underlying it is this assumption that talks about business or private enterprise more writ large, which is that the purpose of private enterprise is to maximize profit. The purpose of the rule of law is to promote the sort of fundamental accountability, fairness, and justice criteria. And so I'm wondering, as you try to create a synergy between what these two fundamental things are, or what are the aims, how do you, and you talk, and Chris, you talked a lot about how you're trying to get them to actually see one another as not so bad, but mutually beneficial to one another. So as I contemplate your philosophical point that you raised earlier, it almost seems like you're suggesting that that the space is almost narrower, and that if you can't agree and that they're philosophically opposed, you're left with nothing. So what would your advice then be? Just, you know, look with deep suspicion upon any corporate entity and say, you know, hold them at arm's bay. But Chris was making the point earlier that didn't fundamentally work. That engagement was the only way to fundamentally make that work. So I'm trying to figure out what's the through line, what's the pathway in a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll take a stab at it. And this is fundamental to the work we do. We're trying to build long-termism within companies. And the thing is, how do we do that? We change law. So one thing, I mean, we worked on in previous administrations, and even under Obama's SEC, it was not very easy, which is moving from short-term shareholder-driven profit maximization to stakeholder concern or public benefit. And if you think about it, corporations are chartered by us, right? They get a charter from society to operate within a jurisdiction. But we've kind of relinquished all of those assumptions, and now we view companies as dictating policy. So I think fundamentally, when I ended my remarks by saying short-termism is the problem here, I do believe short-termism is to our peril as societies. And if we're going to offshore responsibility and outsource it to the private sector around development, at least let us build long-term incentives for companies to do this right.
I agree with that. I think the short-termism versus long-termism is part of it, for sure. I don't think that the space is actually shrinking. I think the space between these two, let's say the public-minded folks over here and the private profit-minded folks over here, I think there is a lot more of a sweet spot that just has not been realized. And a big part of this issue, big part for me, has been trying to figure out creative ways to make the case to people in the business side of this thing. And one of the things that I'm always struck by is the fact that every person working in a company is also a consumer, a worker, a woman, has a, you know, and will suffer climate change as much as, you know, the rest of it. And so getting, you know, I think that someone earlier made the comment about millennials are starting to ask the right questions, and let's hope so. I think that a lot of the corporate change will be driven by employees not wanting to work for a bad company. Let's put it as simply as that. And that has always, I think, been a big part of of the business case that has gone unutilized by the NGO community. We worked at I worked at a law firm The law firms know this, so they do all kinds of pro bono stuff because they know that 30% of their people coming in go to the firm to do pro bono, and then they can do whatever pillage over here, but they got a pro bono thing over here, and that worked pretty well for them. But they recognized we got to keep our people happy, and the Walmarts also realized this, and so you get to and Starbucks, we went to the baristas. That's what in the end it wasn't the consumers that drove it was the baristas. But I want to say another thing because land is so beautiful on this issue. Companies have ignored land rights for a long time, and we have seen a real shift in recent years around this on two fronts. One is a lot of the companies going into these new markets in Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America are starting to realize that they can't get away with the kind of practices that worked 10 or 20 years ago. They can't just go in, get the legal license from the government, seize 40 hectares and build some kind of infrastructure. It just doesn't work because there are too many stakeholders that are raising hell for them and creating problems. So as a matter of business practice now, social conflict has become the number one business risk for a lot of the extractives and infrastructure companies. And it took a while to sort of get that to penetrate. It took the Harvards and Goldman Sachs and others to study this issue and put it on paper. You are going to lose a lot of money if you think that legal license is enough. So go get social license. Go do the free prime farm. Do the process. It makes sense. But then the negative case on land, let's just stick to that, is pretty well documented now. But there's a really good positive case too, and we're just starting to see some of the ag companies realize this also. There's a beautiful one here on cocoa in Ghana, and I was just talking to them. The lack of the companies like Mars and Nestle's and others have been trying to figure out for years, why can't we improve cocoa productivity? It's terrible. They're keeping all these old plants, and they finally come around to realize it's because women can't get their basic land rights. And if they don't have secure land rights, they are not going to cut down those trees that they've been tending, because that's like their one stake in that particular piece of land. And the minute it gets cut down and you put in a new sapling, their land is vulnerable to be taken away. And so there is a positive case. Companies need to come around and start advocating for women's land rights. It sounds very esoteric, but that's just one example. Costco realizes that empowering workers down their supply chain makes them better stewards of food safety. That's who made that case, but that really is a good case. So I see a big part of this is how do we start getting more creative to make the case that it really is in the company's interest. If they can just look a little beyond their sort of comfort zones, they'll see their way to climate change or workers' rights for the most part. Now, there are going to always be inseparable parts, and there we just have to fight, as Amal said, and get the government to come in and legislate those issues.
Chris, I want to follow up on this question of time horizons, this issue of time horizons. And we talk about it from a private sector perspective, and there certainly can be circumstances in which companies have a short-term time horizon there. But what about from a government perspective? To the extent that you're working with government partners on any of these projects, one of the challenges we have at USAID is that some of our budget priorities are determined by earmarks in Congress, so they're highly specialized and specific. Others are time limited, so that we only have a certain period of time to work within a certain area on a certain project. And what we've discovered as countries graduate, which is a weird word and one that I don't think is very useful, but when countries no longer receive foreign assistance, that's usually the product of time, cooperation, and money. And so if you don't have a particularly long time horizon, that seems to be the case with a lot of the way that aid is distributed today. How can you even work on that side if you have short-termism occurring within the public sector?
I have an answer for that, but
You have an answer? Oh,
I
yeah.
do have an answer for that, but it's not the answer probably that a lot of people in the audience or up here could give us, which would be getting into the psyche of short-term government. My answer is you should never depend on governments or companies. You should depend on the people who are affected. That is the long-term strategy. If we can get people who are affected by corruption or bad development or human rights violations to be empowered in some significant way on the long term, they will be the long-term guardians of sustainable development. And that has been, again, I go back to the basic rule of development that we learned 20 or 30 years ago, and it has been emphasized over and over again. You can't think that passing a law is going to help if you don't have somebody that's going to insist on implementation. And you can't think that you've won the day if you get one company to do something because the CEO changes, or you get a change in administration or whatever it is. But if the people who are affected are being gradually strengthened and better educated and have more resources and tools, and the technology works for them rather than others, then that would be, I think, the longer term way to deal with your issue. But there might be a better issue on the government side. I just don't know that one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know on the government side either. I mean, I would say the thing I feel deeply about what you just said, that's very much a core to all the work I do. But I also feel that with companies, it is, the more you can embed the work, whatever the human rights work is, whether it's about women or environment, any of these things, if you embed them more in actual positive business outcomes as opposed to the foundation or sort of lightweight sort of CSR thing, then there's a reason for the companies to keep doing it, regardless of who the CEO is, right? Because there's an economic incentive, but it's a challenge to build those strategies, and it's a challenge to build them with the people on the ground who, are going to continue to be really making sure that things happen and hold people to them.
What's your answer, Amal?
I don't know. I think, next question.
Other questions? Right down in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Bobby from Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where Chris is our chair of the Board of Trustees. Chris kind of nailed actually one issue that I wanted to raise, which we've heard from local NGO partners, particularly in Southeast Asia. We've been asked, why are we spending like portions, for example, of this project, or why are we spending scarce resources to create this space and to get these private enterprises to be part of discussions where we could be spending it on strengthening groups so that they are able to protect their own rights, etc. And so the question is, on one hand, a question of strategy as to what and as to whether NGOs should be entering these kinds of partnerships or not. But on the other, there are very practical dimensions to it. Like, for example, is there supposed to be like a set of standards as to who should be paying for this space to exist for public and private actors to work on rule of law issues? And on the other hand, too, it raises the question of when we work to create these spaces, are we actually bridging the gap between, the more campaigny groups that are quite difficult for private enterprises to talk with and communicate with? Or are we just further strengthening the efforts of groups that are already very comfortable speaking among themselves? Like, meaning, how are we channeling resources so that we are enabling the private enterprises to talk with groups that are quote unquote difficult to talk to?
I have lots and lots and lots of things to say about that, but I'll try to be short. I do think that I think that you need to be in those spaces. I think those spaces need to be sort of their best when they're sort of carefully facilitated and curated, and that you have people who are real bridge builders who are perceived as being on both sides, so people are comfortable in them. I think you want to try to, my experience, but I don't think they're a waste of time. I think you should try to get the companies to pay just from an economic fairness point of view. But sometimes it's like a lost leader if it's a strategy you as an NGO are building and you're trying to build relationships, and just the power of getting people in the room and building personal relationships, because you all go out to dinner and you talk about the issues over dinner, or you talk about your families and then you go back in the room and talk about the issues, is a powerful space to be in, so that the next time the company has an issue in Myanmar, they pick up the call and they don't call a big NGO next door or whose buddy is on their board, but they call you because, oh, I know you and you're there. You need those kinds of communal, collective spaces to build those relationships in a way, or opportunities to do that. And so sometimes they're maybe worth the money, but you have to have enough commonality in whatever those spaces are, very issue-focused and very facilitated and driven, I think, to really get outcomes that, I'm not saying you all want to be the same, that's the last thing you want to be, but I'm not ever worried about that because I think people coming from these spaces are very different. And I think those conversations can be very powerful, but if they can't be too much of a free-for-all, and it can't be people who are, you want people who are at least at the stage of not questioning any engagement whatsoever. I mean, potentially. Like, all right, they may have a lot of institutional issues with engaging with corporations. They might have a lot of personal issues with corporations, and they clearly have a lot of resource issues. But at least if they have a frame that this is something they want to do and they've started doing, and you're talking about an issue that people can engage on, I think those are powerful. But I do think you should always ask, because my mother said all they can say is no, and so and companies have a lot of money and they think about money in a very different way, so.
Okay, just really quickly, another kind of, I think it's a really fair point, and I think, at least from our perspective at ICAR, we do straddle between sort of the engagement, and like, let me mention this multi-stakeholder initiative I talked about earlier on private security contractors. Would I ever known that I would be engaging with 300 private security contractors on human rights issues? No. I know that some in the civil society space question the initiative as a whole because it legitimizes private security. But it's also a reality that governments are increasingly outsourcing private security. In fact, NGOs use private security.
Right.
So I think what we're trying to say is, look, if it's going to exist, let's build standards and accountability over it, so long as the processes do that. If they are a fig leaf for that, there's no point in getting involved.
I think we've got one more question here.
Well, maybe not so much a question. It's Olivier Kambala. I think maybe I want to stem from the point that you just raised about accountability. Because since this morning I've been kind of puzzled to understand over and over again that there is no way we can have a common understanding on what is the rule of law. And that's perhaps for me the most important problem, because, I mean, if there is a rule of law that's working in America or in Canada or in Australia, the very same rule of law should be able to work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's where maybe I think we may want to have some very concrete example. I mean, I don't know if you've heard about the case of Anvil Mining,
Exactly.
an Australian and Canadian company
Exactly.
that with money borrowed from Australia and Canada has been running some mining operation in the Katanga province in the DRC, helping the army to commit atrocities, and then getting away with that in Congo, I can understand, but getting away with that in Canada and Australia, I understand it. And if there is no accountability on both sides of the process, both ends of the business, then we will still in a situation where we can accept that that company can actually violate the rules in Congo, violate the rule of law in Congo, but still continue to be in the stock exchange in Canada or in Australia and still get away with that. So for me, really, the beginning of the answer could be maybe to get to them some sort of consensus on what actually is the rule of law, regardless of where it applies.
Yeah, I think that's a super good point. I mean, the other thing I will say, it's funny, and I don't mean this in a flippant way, but I also question whether, I know America, and we're using this sort of rule of law concept to apply to sort of rule of law issues there. I think we have tremendous rule of law issues here, increasingly so in recent days, perhaps hours, BuzzFeed. But so I think, it's a fair point, and I think I think the primacy of the rule of law really does come down to the question of independence, and of systems that allow for accountability and independence. And when those are corrupted, then you can't say that you have a rule of law, in my opinion. And I think that, I think we need to be looking at the private sector's role in corrupting or influencing those just as much at home as we do abroad.
I think that's actually a good point to end on, because to the earlier point that I made right at the beginning of this panel, which is that we often don't make those connections between the work that we do internationally and the work that we do domestically. We also don't make the connections between the problems that we have domestically and how they are very similar to the problems that we have internationally, whether it's corruption or any of these deficiencies, you know, even from a land reform perspective. In South Carolina, we've got this issue called heirs property, which is property that doesn't have clear title because it's held in common. And that's a cultural dynamic that has played out within an established legal system, which works to the detriment of those individuals because they can't leverage the property.
Right.
But as we talk about accountability, transparency, you know, all these aspects of the rule of law, what's emerged as a common theme for me is something I've heard over and over today, and that's building relationships, whether it's relationships among lawyers, among people who are coming into a country to work, among people across different sectors. And it's more than networking. I know this is DC, but it's more than networking.
more.
It's
more.
not just getting your name out there. It is actually establishing a connection with someone so that when a problem occurs, you're actually talking to someone who's familiar. And perhaps we could take upon us the challenge to create those spaces that can convene individuals and build some of those relationships and build some of those networks. Thank you for your time and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, John, for not only ending on a positive note, but also to reaffirm what the mission of Just Track is, which is to promote interagency collaboration and cooperation, which is the point of both today's symposium and our upcoming events. So I'd like to conclude today's event by thanking the panelists, the speakers who have traveled far and near, for their enormous contributions to today's discussion, and to all of you for participating. We look forward to seeing you at the next Just Track event. There will be another symposium at the end of June, which will take place at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And there will also be a training that will look at issues of corruption and security sector reform. So we will continue our engagement, and we welcome your feedback for those of you that have not completed your evaluations, because we believe in being transparent and spending taxpayer money with the greatest level of accountability. That your feedback is welcome, and we thank you all. Have a good day.
So we gotta get together in DC.
Yeah, I'm in New York.
Oh, you're in New York. Okay, we'll get to New York. Well, either way, yeah, I'm here, but I'm up in New York a lot.